So today I'm sitting here by the great rolling Columbia River at Beebe Bridge State Park. My husband and I are metal detecting. He's metal detecting, and I'm working on projects for the 12-month clothing challenge. I just finished the Irish Lena, and now I'm working on a couple of small knitting projects because, for one thing, I have some really awesome yarn and I'm looking forward to working with that. And also, I just found some very cool patterns from the 16th century, some hat patterns and some other small knitted item kind of patterns, and so I'm going to be working on those in the next couple of weeks, just to take a little break from sewing and the larger projects. But I went history bounding today in my slightly Anne of Green Gables outfit, and I'll give you a little insight into how I work through a new pattern, how to find a yarn that works well for that pattern, depending on what I have in my stash. I don't like to buy yarn for new projects very much, partly because I actually raise sheep, and so I have some yarn that's made from my own sheep wool, and I'd really prefer to use that. And so there's some adjustments that you have to make if the yarn for the pattern doesn't exactly match the yarn that you have in stash. So I'll walk you through that a little bit, show you a couple of things that the process of working it out. So there were a couple of things that weren't working well the last time I was here at Beebe Park. Generally what you're doing is you look at the needle size, you look at the gauge, the suggested gauge, you look at the yarn that you'd like to use, or the yarn that's written in the pattern, and those three things plus the sizing within the pattern itself affect the size. And so in order to make it the correct size, you have to kind of adjust those three things. Yarn comes thin and yarn comes thick, and the yarn that this pattern was written for was from a company that no longer exists. I was trying to find the yarn online on the Ravelry website, which, if you are a knitter, you need to know about Ravelry. I didn't know all about it before I started knitting. When I came back to knitting as an adult, I had to kind of be reintroduced to Ravelry, but Ravelry is a rocking place. It's the place to go. And you can find out all kinds of data about the yarn that's actually in the pattern from Ravelry that is not included in even like the information that comes on the label. And so you can find things like how many wraps per inch, which is critical in deciding how big your pattern should be and how many adjustments you need to make to the pattern. So that's been super helpful, and I'll walk you through that. So I got this really awesome book called Knitted Garb, and it's from the Plymouth Plantation, which is a living history kind of museum. And basically it's like an English settler village from the 1500s, late 1500s. And the Knitted Garb book is awesome. I am very picky about my patterns. I do not like to use patterns that don't have a particular look about them. If they look at all sloppy or at all rough, I just really prefer to do something that's finer in my knitting, and especially in my spinning. So this book has been really awesome. And then I'm using a pattern from that book called the Gunnister Cap with the turned up brim, which actually is a gorgeous pattern. It's shown in the Harrisville New Plymouth worsted, and that yarn is actually a little bit more chunky than I like. It's technically, I think they called it an Aran weight, which is 9 wraps to the inch. Like if you wrap the yarn around a ruler and you see how many wraps are on that ruler, that gives you an idea of how fat the yarn is, right? And so the wraps per inch can be translated into, different kinds of sizes. that is a little bit, in fact it's quite a bit chunkier than the yarn I want to use, which is actually yarn that I used to belong to a wool cooperative, a wool and alpaca cooperative, and that group would produce yarns with the input of the member cooperative sheep farms or alpacas. And so I have this beautiful, beautiful alpaca wool mix that my sheep's wool is actually included in this run of that yarn, and it is to die for. And so I really wanted to use that, but it's actually a sock weight, so it's considerably smaller than the chunky worsted that is written for this pattern. So I started knitting this project with this yarn, which is actually produced by a really good friend of mine from local wool. But this yarn is beautiful. I believe that she indigo dyed it. She actually has it spun by a processor, but then she dyes them herself with natural dyes. And I was so excited to work with this yarn because she's a good friend of mine and I love her and I love her sheep, but the indigo is not color fast. And so as I started working with it, my hands were turning blue. and that's not necessarily conducive to, you know, something that you want to give as a gift to someone else. I could just see my husband, you know, wearing this hat and, you know, coming home with a blue forehead after work. But so much as I love this yarn, it also was a little bit coarse and a little bit uneven for the purposes that I want to put it to. So the hat pattern that I'm using is, I just think that it would look a lot more sophisticated, a lot more clean with a smaller gauge yarn. So we'll use this for something where the color fastness is not a problem. I love Katie and love her yarns, but I just was sad that the color fastness wasn't there. And oftentimes that's true if you use a natural dye. They have to be set with a mordant that's rather harsh, and so if you don't get that just right, the color can come out. And indigo's especially bad. So I was sad about that because I love this color. And it just wasn't, the hand of it just wasn't right for me. But now I'll show you the really good version. So this actually is the yarn that I want to use. It's in a beautiful, super light rose gray kind of color. There are little specks occasionally of a dark brown yarn, which is actually, that might be from my sheep, because my sheep were like a cream color, but then I have some color in my flock, so they might have had some dark spots. But this is actually, as you can tell, a sock yarn. It's quite a bit thinner, almost half as thin as the yarn that I was just using. But if I double this, then you can see that it lays really nicely. And this actually has quite a bit of alpaca in it, so it's going to be super, super soft. Much softer than the full wool yarn that I was trying to use before. And I just love it. I love the color, I love the handle, I love the weight. I started knitting with it and instantly it was like, yes, this is it. This is the one. So we'll go forward with this. So there is a beautiful phrase at the beginning of most patterns that says, cast on X number of stitches. And that's a beautiful phrase. A beautiful phrase. It's very short. You would think it would take no time at all to do that. Casting on X number of stitches, believe it or not, takes a long time. So for example, for this project, I have cast on now probably 5 times. Not because I made a mistake, not because I didn't count properly, not because I was having trouble actually casting on, because I don't have trouble with any of that. This particular pattern said cast on loosely. And I do what's called a long tail cast on. And my tension in my knitting is a little bit tight. And so I tend to cast on fairly tight. I did not with me have a set of larger needles, which you can actually cast onto a larger set of needles and create a looser cast on and then switch to your smaller needles and continue knitting. However, I don't have any other needles with me. I was looking around for something I could use, but what I did have was a crochet hook in sort of a similar size. It's actually a little bit bigger than my knitting needles, but you know, it's comparable. It's in there somewhere. And what I did was hold this up against the needle that I was casting onto, and that actually made a beautiful, beautiful cast on. And that, my friends, is how loose you can make a nice cast on if you use your beautiful crochet hook that is about the same size as the needle, right? So after casting on 5 separate times, trying to get the tension correct, trying to get the cast on looseness correct, trying to figure out which needle size to use, trying different sizes of yarn and seeing how that worked, I finally hit on something. And this is sort of a thing that I don't think that very many knitting people talk about, but when you hit the right combination of yarn and needles and complexity of pattern, and you just kind of get all those pieces right for the vision that you have in your head, there's this state of flow that starts to happen. And you go, ooh, ah, that's gonna be cool. And so I've hit that point now after 5 cast-ons with this particular project. I've hit the, oh yeah, that's happening moment. And I'm so excited because I just love that moment. You work and work and work to get it that way, and sometimes you feel like, oh, it's just not ever gonna happen, it's not gonna work, it's gonna have to be a compromise, it's not gonna be beautiful, but it is. It's coming. You just gotta work through those little steps. So especially with knitting, and especially if you're new at knitting, keep trying. It's all about tension. And any kind of fiber art, including sewing, including embroidery, including knitting, crochet, including making rope, including all kinds of fiber related arts, it really does matter about the tension. And that tension is affected by about 25 different things. And so when you're first learning, basically you're just trying to get the motion down and trying to figure out how to get the muscle memory to actually do the thing. But after a while, you're going to realize that where you put your fingers on the needle, for example, or how you're tensioning your yarn, and whether, for example, even that you have your yarn ball in a place where it can't pull out smoothly, like with even tension, it starts to bind up a little bit, you'll find that it affects the tension within the piece a lot. That tension is the kicker. That tension is the thing that will make or break a project. And now I finally think I've got the balance beautiful between the size of the needles and the type of yarn and the number of strands I'm using at a time and all that. So this one, I'm looking forward to it. I'll show it off in a little bit because it shouldn't take too long to knit. So I will tell you a story. It's not necessarily a funny story, though I find it actually a little bit hilarious. Once upon a time, I was a very small child, probably 7 or 8 years old, and someone tried to teach me how to knit, and I kind of learned, but I was pretty frustrated with it. Then I came back to it when I was a little bit older. And in order to help me learn how to knit, I went and got a book from the library. And I started following the instructions in the book in the library because, you know, I didn't have the internet back then, so I wasn't looking at YouTube videos and getting myself straight. So I taught myself how to knit again, and I knit for years and years and years and years. And then sometimes projects would just not come out looking the same way as the project directions showed, and I thought, well, that's kind of weird. Why is that? But I go back and look, and I was doing all the things right, doing all the things the way I thought I should be doing them. And then one day, well, I'm not a very big math person, so I had always thought, oh, lace knitting, that's just like way beyond me. I can't keep my place in a pattern. I can't count that much. I can't keep that many numbers in my head at a time. So I'm just never going to be able to knit lace. But then I actually organized a fiber festival in my town, and I had some teachers come, and I was so excited because there was a lady there who said that she had a bunch of tricks for doing lace knitting. And so I took a class, and I was sitting in class learning how to lace knit. And she had all kinds of very cool things for non-numbery people to be able to actually knit lace patterns. And I was so excited. But the problem is that I started looking at my lace knitting and it didn't look like it was supposed to. Looked very weird. Did not look like the pattern at all. And so I was looking at told the teacher, I just don't think this is working well. This is not the right, something's going wrong. And then we got farther along in the pattern, and the pattern said, knit through the back loop. And I thought, knit through the back loop? How do you do that? That's what I've been doing all along. So how is that different from actual knitting? So what I realized is I had actually been knitting through the back loop instead of actually knitting. And so I had to unlearn years and years of muscle memory knitting through the back loop instead of actually knitting. And so when I got done with that class, I was so frustrated because my lace knitting just did not look like lace. And I realized what I had done years and years ago. And I thought, well, this is going to take some time and effort to kind of fix. And it did. But I decided at that time that instead of feeling bad about it, if I was going to have to relearn how to knit anyway, I used to knit what's called English style or throwing. And so continental knitting is immeasurably faster anyway. And if I was going to have to relearn all the muscle memory around my knitting anyway, I was just going to relearn how to do that so that I could do it faster. One of my biggest pet peeves with knitting, learning how, was I didn't want to do large projects because it just took way too long to do them. But if I continental knitted them, it would be quicker. And so I did that. It took about 1.5 years to finally unlearn how to knit the way I'd taught myself how to knit all those many years ago. But now my lace knitting looks like lace. So much better outcome, much better story too. Spent a lot of time on airplanes that year learning how to continental knit and unlearn how to do knitting through the back loop every time. So it took a while. My fingers were fumbling, but it was, and now I think it's funny, but at the time it wasn't funny. It was rather overwhelming. But now I can actually knit lace and it looks really good. So there's a lace panel on this pattern, yarn overs and such like that. So anyhow, that's my story. So I just boarded the crazy train. I don't know what I was looking at, actually. Something online or something, some kind of pattern somewhere, where people were using 000 size needles, US. And I have some really awesome sock yarn that my sheep's fleece is actually part of. And I thought, shoot, we should try that. We should try 000 needles. So this has been an adventure already. I don't know if you've ever seen the Tenniel illustration from Alice Through the Looking Glass, but you remember the sheep and she had so many, she kept taking the needles and putting more knitting needles in her knitting. That's sort of what I feel like right now. I also feel a little bit like I'm knitting with toothpicks because literally they are the width of toothpicks. They're longer, but they're the width of toothpicks. Yeah, so I started to knit with them, and then, no kidding, I was knitting along. I literally put down the needle that I had in my hand for 2 seconds. Did not move, did not get up, did not pass go, did not collect $200. Simply put the thing down in my lap, and it disappeared. And literally got up, shook out my clothes, like took the whole couch apart, went my fingers down all the holes in the couch, panicked, had to go outside and do some work, and was deathly afraid that I had it on my person somewhere and was dropping it out in the field, and came in and thought, no, it couldn't possibly be in the field. Where did it go? So my husband, bless his heart, is the finder in our family, and he actually dug through the couch, and literally there are places in my couch that you cannot get to with like a chopstick. And it had fallen into one of those spots, and we had to take a butter knife and double stick tape and wrap a big wad of double stick tape on the end of the knife and stick it to this tiny little needle and pull it out. So I just have to show you. This is just the crazy train. For real. This is knitting with toothpicks. So yeah, this looks like knitting. Looks like knitting with a bleeding toothpick. Look at the size of that thing. That is the craziest thing I have ever tried to do in my life. Yeah, and so my plan was, yeah, right. My plan was, gee, it'd be nice to figure out how they actually used to knit stockings. Because stockings, if you've ever worn stockings, you know, stockings are a thing. They're an important thing up here in the Great White North where it gets very cold in the winter. Stockings would be great. I want to knit my own stockings. I want to knit my own stockings from my own wool. Yeah, sure. With 000 needles. Uh-huh. Yeah, so yes, of course, because I am crazy and I boarded the crazy train, I am going to do this. I don't know how stinking long it's going to take me, and it may take me years, but at least you've seen the germination of that idea, and the fact that I have to literally put sheets on my couch so that I don't lose the needles down the holes of the couch. Yep, bed sheets on the couch. Mm-hmm. Yep, in order not to lose the toothpick-sized needles. Literally. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, it's a thought. I'll keep you posted.